Good morning.
Good morning, Lisa.
How are you, Nicole?
I am doing much better.
Good, good. Well, folks, if you have ever wondered what an emotional support animal is or how to get one, Nicole and I are going to talk about ESAs today. And my cat is right here, so she might be wandering by just to like give you a little reminder of how nice animals can be. But before we go any further, if you've been having a hard time taking care of yourself lately, you are not alone. Go to selfcaretips.org/free guide. Download our info about how to kickstart your self-care plan, and hopefully that'll help you out. So I feel like we should just acknowledge that we haven't been on here for the past couple of weeks. Do you want to share what's been going on?
Well, it's interesting how we have been talking about, the fear of COVID and the difficulties that we've been facing. And I personally experienced COVID and what it has done with both me and my partner. So I had to take a little bit of a hiatus.
I've been so worried about you.
Yeah. It's very, it was an experience for sure. But we're both doing really well.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, me too.
All right, so yeah, let's talk about emotional support animals. So what prompted me to bring up this topic is that I have been writing seriously all weekend. I'm working on a new book all about emotional support animals, and it's geared toward other clinicians, so counselors, social workers, therapists who are thinking, they might want to learn how to do an ESA assessment and write the recommendation letter for their clients. So I have emotional support animals on the book, and I think people, not just clinicians, but also folks that could potentially get an ESA have questions, right? They want to know about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually had quite a few people ask me, recently about what is an ESA and, how do I go about getting one, or, who qualifies, like those kinds of things. So this is definitely a great time to talk about it.
Yeah, it's not something that's taught in most of our clinical programs. And you know what I found? A lot of counselors and actually psychologists too, they just won't write the letter, and they end up calling me and referring their clients over to me to do the assessment and write the letter, which I appreciate, obviously. It's something I'm super passionate about, and I'm always happy to meet people and do the assessment. But it's actually pretty easy to learn. It takes a little bit of effort to understand like the theory behind it, the scientific rationale, and there's a little supervision that goes along anytime we learn a new service. But ultimately, this isn't a tough thing to learn. So I figured I would write my knowledge down and share it with the world.
I much appreciated. I know, joining the practice, I definitely got a crash course in what, animal assisted therapy looks like, having an ESA. So I look forward to reading this book and getting more knowledge.
Yeah. And before we go, I'll give you a sneak peek of what the cover is going to look like.
Oh, yes. Perfect.
I guess let's just start with a definition. So an emotional support animal is really, it can be any kind of animal, but it's usually a dog or a cat, maybe a rabbit, but usually an animal that you think of living in someone's home, that bonds with an individual who's under the care of a mental health professional. So there's a couple of things in that definition that are important. So the animal bonds with one single person, right? And that's part of what makes them different from a therapy dog. So Benji, he comes in and provides comfort to whoever is in our office, right? So Benji supports a lot of people because he's a therapy dog. An emotional support dog would just bond with a single individual and give them the emotional comfort.
Okay.
And then it's key that it's in their home, because emotional support animals are different from service animals. They're not permitted to go into public spaces or private spaces that have a no pets policy. They're really only allowed in an individual's home. And that's actually different from what we told people last year, because there's a recent law that was amended the Air Carrier Access Act, I believe it's called, a federal law that used to say emotional support animals were permitted on board aircraft with people, but they no longer are. So ESAs strictly in your home. And the way that it's beneficial, there's a few things that an ESA is going to do. It's going to make it so that the person with the ESA doesn't have to pay, pet fees in their home. They can have the animal in their home even if their landlord or landlady has a no pets policy, because it's considered a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. So I gave you a short definition and then I unpacked all of it. Is it making sense so far?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you highlight a bunch of questions that have been asked of what is the difference between an ESA and a service animal? I get a lot because sometimes we accidentally kind of say one and mean the other.
Right.
And also when it comes to talking to a landlord, a lot of landlords, they have restrictions on different kinds of animals, the breed of dogs, those kinds of things. So a lot of people are wondering, hey, if I have a landlord, if I'm in an apartment or if I'm, renting or whatever that looks like, am I still allowed to have an ESA?
Yeah. And so the answer is maybe. So there's a couple of things that have to happen when you come in to be assessed for an emotional support animal. One of the things that people should know right up front is just because you're getting an ESA assessment doesn't mean you're going to get that letter, right? There are certain things that we're looking for. It is a formal assessment that we're doing. So an individual should fit the criteria for a specific mental health disorder. And that's why we break out that big blue book, the DSM-5, and we're looking to make sure that this really is an applicable mental health concern. We have to know that the individual getting the ESA can ethically care for the animal, or they have someone else in the home that can participate in the care of the animal, because we're not just thinking about what's going on for the client. We're also, we have to care for the animal too. There was another piece to that I was going to add. You said that, can anyone get the letter? I forget where I was going with that, but oh well, we're doing this live.
Yeah, but I hear you with having to not only make sure that the person would benefit from having an ESA, but also being able to care for the ESA as well. I mean, they're living beings. We want to make sure that, there's no neglect or anything going on once you get the animal. So that makes sense that there would be that checkpoint.
Right. And an animal can be expensive to own. The vet bills, the food, the toys, all of that. And what we don't want is our clients to end up with a financial burden, because that's just going to add to the stressors in their life, not take away. Right.
Yeah.
And then something else that a lot of people don't realize is that when you get an emotional support animal letter, you're committing to a comprehensive mental health treatment plan, right? So you don't just get the letter and then go home and hang out with your cat. Right. You're saying, I am going into therapy. I'm seeing a counselor, I'm seeing a psychiatrist or psychologist, and I'm going to do this ongoing plan where the ESA is one small piece. Right. And the letter actually has an expiration date on it. Right. So at the end of 1 year, the person will come back in and ask for the letter to be, rewritten with a new date. And if they say, oh, I haven't been going to my therapy, they're not going to get a new letter.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's kind of like when you have different alternative pieces to therapy that can happen. An ESA is an offshoot of what you're actually doing in the therapy setting.
Yeah. And in an ideal situation, the counselor is going to have a background in creative therapeutic techniques that use the human animal bond, right? So your therapist is going to say, okay, your homework this week is to, practice self-care by taking your dog for a walk every day, or your homework this week is to practice the thought stopping technique, but use it in your dog's voice, right? Do something kind of creative or a little bit different, but they're actually bringing the animal into the mental health practices.
Oh, that like it's so incredible. Well, just like the bond that one can have with animals, but also the, benefits of bringing that into the counseling room.
Yeah. Yeah. So, do you have other questions?
So one question that I actually have had is when I look online about ESAs, or even like therapy dogs, some people will say like, "Oh, this breed's a good one," or "Don't use that breed." Is there like a specific list of dogs or animals in general that are allowed to be ESAs?
Well, any animal can be an emotional support animal because
Okay.
what's important is the mental health treatment and the bond that the human is developing with the animal. That said, there are recommendations. So now we're going to move from emotional support animals into therapy animals, right? Because well, no one's written the book on emotional support animals yet. But there are some resources when you start thinking about therapy animals. And Cynthia Chandler wrote a really good book. I think it's called Animal Assisted Therapy and Counseling. And she talks about like selecting the right animal, or what kind of breed is going to be, like smart, easily trained, right? Appropriate, like, sized if you're, to care for your animal. So like there are some recommendations, but there's no requirements.
Interesting. Yeah, I've heard like, obviously the standard dog or cat for an ESA, but I've also heard like people having like hedgehogs, or there was an emu that was like an emotional support animal, and I was like,
Right on.
what? Yes, I would love one. I think that's so cool. And again, like you're saying, like having that a connection with the animal. Some people are naturally cat people or dog people, or like a lot of us in the office, just animal people in general. And so it's interesting to hear like the different, again, that difference between for a therapy, animal versus an ESA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Pet Partners, which is like the gold standard organization that evaluates human animal teams that go out and do like the volunteer work in schools and hospitals. So they have a list of like 8 or 10 animals that they recommend, and they will evaluate. So I have it memorized. Like rabbits, horses, alpaca, they're all on the list. Dogs and cats, of course.
Yes.
And I once saw a headline talking about a person with an emotional support alligator, and I didn't click on it because that just sounded. I won't be judgmental, but let's not bring alligators onto airplanes, right? or necessarily into your home.
Woo, yeah, that sounds different.
Right.
For a specific, yes.
Yeah. But can I show you the cover of the book?
Yes,
The draft? Yeah. Let me see if I can. I always share screen. That's what I need to do. There it is.
Oh my goodness!
Of course, it had to be Benji on the cover, right?
He's so photogenic. It kills me.
So I don't have a launch date yet. I don't know when I'm going to get this out there, but I'm keeping it simple with this. I really just want to get the knowledge out to other clinicians. I'm going to put it up on Amazon Kindle. It's going to be really affordable and hopefully really informative.
Oh my goodness. Yes, I will totally be in line waiting for this book to come out. You really like, yeah, you've brought like so much more knowledge to me about like a whole other sector of counseling that I did not really pay much attention to, because like you're right, like we don't talk about this at school. It's all the other different techniques and those kinds of things, but this is something completely different. I remember just like reading like a little paragraph about like, yep, animal assisted therapy exists. There are ESAs. And we move on to the next alternative, right. So,
yeah. So hopefully this fills a gap.
Yes, I love it.
Very cool. Well, Nicole, again, I'm so grateful that you've recovered from COVID and that you're doing okay now. We're happy to have you back.
Oh, I'm happy to be back.
And folks watching, if you have comments or questions about emotional support, alligators, or any other kind of animals, we would so love to hear your thoughts.